Okay, thank you for coming, everybody. We're excited to be joined again by Cary Moon. Cary was at our July 9th meeting, and I urge everybody to watch the videos that we've posted up on our website. We asked Cary and Jenny the same questions on the issues of neighborhood engagement and planning, on gentrification, on livability, and on growth in the city. And we're going to try and refrain from talking about those issues today, unless you feel a compelling reason to get clarification from Cary. Cary, my first question for you today is, how did you get here?
Yes. To this position and running.
No, how did you get here physically?
I got here physically today.
It's on microphone.
By car. I usually walk and take transit, but I have a whole bunch of different things today, so I borrowed my husband's work car to come by car.
We'll come back and talk about that issue in a little bit. Cary, you know, when you and I, a couple of years ago, had an extended conversation, and my recollection of that, it focused a lot on issues of how do we support growth with transit, and the issue of migrating from our car-centric city and our city layout to one where there's less use of an automobile, more use of transit and so on. And you've spoken quite a bit about that at a high level. And I think perhaps everyone can understand maybe where we want to be, but there is this reality of people do have cars even if they commute by walking or transit to their job. We have issues of parking in neighborhoods. We have issues of our public transit system is not robust enough to allow people to literally get off the car, although we're seeing things like car sharing and that sort of thing moving in to help fill the gaps. Can you talk a little bit about the transition and how you as mayor would make that transition happen?
That's a good question because it's such a complicated challenge. We all know we want a robust transit system that serves all neighborhoods with high-speed, reliable, convenient transit. But to get there costs money, and it takes a lot of collaboration with the county and with Sound Transit and other regional players. It takes funding from the state, and those are all kind of the third rails, pun intended, of politics right now in our region. And I think to get there, we need to look at how we're using the Move Seattle money and make sure we are being very strategic in how we invest the Move Seattle money to shift to complete streets and shift towards more transit service in neighborhoods that are transit dependent. And we need to work more closely with regional players, with Sound Transit, and with King County Metro to do everything we can to get increased funding for transit and get the service hours that we need in our city. We also need to complete, we talked about bus rapid transit, I think, during the Great Viaduct debates 10 years ago. There was this talk about the state and the county would invest in a much more robust bus rapid transit system as part of that investment in viaduct replacement. And unfortunately, the state backed out after it made a promise of $190 million for bus rapid transit. It actually provided zero instead. So I think we've got to keep working with the state to make a true bus rapid transit system, because when you have transit priority at intersections, transit-only lanes on congested streets, and you manage the operations of the transit system at intersections so there's no conflict with pedestrians, and you really work on getting enough service hours where it's faster and cheaper and easier to get to town on transit than in other modes, we really become a city that can use transit and cars only when you absolutely have to, when you have something to carry, when you have kids, when you're trip chaining like I am today. And I think the more you make transit convenient, the more most trips can move to transit and leave space on the streets for the trips that can't use transit. And I think that's still our goal, but getting there requires funding. And we can talk more about more progressive taxation later, but really it's a bigger commitment to it, and it's getting the funding in place.
How about we have created a situation where in urban villages parking is no longer required, and we see, for example, high-density housing building with 48 CDUs in it, no parking in the project. Yet anecdotally, we're seeing significant percentages of those people having cars. And then we run into this problem of streets are too crowded for parking. There was a recent analysis that showed the number of people in the city driving around just looking for parking spaces. Years ago, I remember in San Francisco, anecdotally, 40% of the traffic in downtown San Francisco is people looking for parking. What do you think, I mean, how do we deal with this issue of we don't have the physical capacity, and yet we've created these ways for developers to externalize the costs of their development onto the general public?
So I hear you. It is not working now what we have. But what we're trying to get to, I think, in the city is a situation where we can separate housing from parking so that developers can produce housing without the additional cost of requiring parking. And then we built such a great transit system that folks can use transit, and we have such great information systems in parking, so we reduce the 40% of trips being trolling for parking. And you know, there's an endpoint, there is a goal, but the way to get there requires that we're investing in transit and transit convenience at the same time we're taking away parking convenience. And that's a disconnect in our system right now because we are doing one without the other. And I understand it's not working and I understand the frustration, but I think the having no parking minimums in buildings is still the right approach because we have to get to a point where we're producing housing at a cost people can afford, and dealing with the transportation system has to be separate from the housing system.
Clarifying question.
Hold on, would you be? Would you be willing to use tools like not allowing RPZ parking permits to be assigned to buildings that were specifically created with no parking? Because what we're seeing is micro-housing projects requesting 30 RPZs overall within that building, that sort of thing. Would you say if a project was created with no parking, with the intent of having residents with no cars, would you somehow, as a way to help as an interim gap, prevent those people from having cars by restricting their use of RPZs?
I'm not sure because that sounds like it's got a real equity issue around wealth, and I would be really careful about going there because, you know, yeah, period.
We talk about in the comprehensive plan concurrency, so that as we develop, we have the impacts of that development and that growth mitigated through concurrency. Concurrency being either the physical capacity or the plans and the financing in place to support that. Is that your definition of concurrency? And what would you do as mayor to make sure that as we grow, we're addressing this problem?
So this is one of the big failures of the past two administrations. We have been growing like gangbusters. Everybody sees it. Everybody's watching it happening. And Planning 101, all these great principles about how you grow the transit system, with the housing system, with the school system. You know, those are all things good planning is about. And we have not done a good job with planning, period. We have, like South Lake Union, I'll pick on that. We developed all that commercial space without a jobs housing balance. So we created this condition where people have to drive to work, and then we didn't do anything to offer transit to those folks. We created that on purpose. We saw that coming 10 years ago, and we didn't do anything to stop it. So the city needs to do a much better job of insisting on jobs housing balance, transit to match growth, school investment to match growth, and make sure that we are convening and collaborating across all the different agencies and different organizations that are responsible for providing those other parts of it. Because if we can't just keep doing what we've been doing. And concurrency is exactly the right goal, and we need to take it more seriously.
You have spoken that you support the grand bargain and the MHA upzones, which have been targeted throughout the city, and in particular potentially include upzones within single-family neighborhoods. Can you talk about what you think the future is for single-family neighborhoods? Do you see single-family being rezoned to higher density RSL throughout the city? Over what time frame? You did mention that you think neighborhood planning should be part of that, and the growth target should be given the neighborhoods, yet MHA is doing this blanket upzoning with a willy-nilly, everywhere type thing.
So In principle, I support mandatory housing affordability requirements and upzones. But I want to make clear that I do not think that they are the solution to the housing affordability crisis. So when I say support them, I support the principle of doing that, making developers pay for affordable housing as they're developing new housing, but it's not going to be the way we get to a city that's more affordable and welcoming and easy for everyone to live in. So I would go back a little bit further and talk about, the city's terrible rollout of HALA. One of the things Mayor Murray's been really good at is he's a legislator. He knows how to get people in a room and force a compromise, but that's not leading a city. That's agreeing on legislation. And to really do this kind of change to allow folks who are moving here to find a place to live, you have to have a much more robust process of working with communities. And this is something we talked about a little bit yesterday at a different forum Marty was at, was the city's job is to create a constructive future vision and an action plan to get there so people understand where we're going. Because if we don't understand where we're going, it makes people really scared and really afraid of the change that's happening because they don't know, are we going to be able to live in Seattle in 5 years? Are my kids going to be able to live in Seattle? Am I going to get pushed out when I'm at retirement age? So people have a tremendous sense of insecurity and wondering where decisions are being made and who's at the table and will I be welcome here? So it makes people really frustrated and angry and resistant to change. A different conversation would be, folks are moving here, all neighborhoods are going to accept some growth because it's our duty as a society to all share in this. And let's work together with neighborhoods around how much growth is coming to your neighborhood and what are some models for growth that would work with you. And this is something we did in the neighborhood planning process in the 90s. There were specific growth targets. The neighborhood and the city collaborated on what tools were available, what makes sense for your neighborhood and the community and the cultural character of your neighborhood that you're trying to preserve, and what are the tools that make most sense for you to achieve your growth targets. That's a constructive, collaborative, future-oriented conversation that we should have had instead of the HALA process, which was top-down, you shall do this, we experts figured this out for you, here is your future, which is that's not right, it's not what democracy is about, it's not what our city is about, and we need to do a better job. So I would restart the process and talk specifically about the future vision and the growth targets for neighborhoods and work with neighborhoods around what are the right tools for your neighborhood. And in a lot of neighborhoods, changing single-family zoning will be on the table because if we can have duplexes, row houses, maybe triplexes, maybe backyard cottages, all those things could work in a neighborhood if that's the right kind of approach you want to take. So let's put everything on the table and work together with neighborhoods about achieving growth targets.
Okay, so to clarify, there have been 5 urban villages that have gone through an MHA upzone or in the process of going through that upzone. The rest of the city upzones associated with MHA are in process through the SEPA process and will be coming in front of council at a point where potentially you would be the city mayor. Are you saying that you would put that on hold until neighborhoods were asked, how do we accept growth into your neighborhoods and try and re-segment that growth on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis in the planning process?
That's my intention, and I don't know where we are in the process and how if it's the right time to intervene, but absolutely I would ask that question and push towards that goal.
And then to clarify, you wouldn't do blanket upzones within the neighborhood. You would ask that neighborhood, where's the best place to put this? And it might include taking some single family and rezoning that, but it would be based on neighborhood discussion as opposed to throughout the whole neighborhood. Is that again what you're saying?
Yes, but just I don't want to promise that the neighborhoods get to do whatever they want. The city has to stand up for the public interest and making sure we have equity issues in consideration, but definitely collaborate with the neighborhoods in a constructive way about what works for you and find common ground.
Okay, very good, thank you. The L in HALA, Housing Affordability and Livability agenda, the L is missing. HALA never deals with the existential and essential question of livability. Will you commit to a citywide discussion process in 2018 to come up with a half a dozen measurable goals that make livability define livability, and then take those goals and include those in the 2018 comprehensive plan?
I don't want to commit to something that specific. I understand livability is an issue, but I also feel like, there's 65 things that were recommended in HOLA, and we never had a community conversation around what of these things work and how do we implement them and what matters in our neighborhood. And what I've learned through lots of years of community process and being involved at different levels in different ways is that it's an ever-changing target. There is not one definition of livability that should be codified in law and forced upon everybody. How we want to live with one another in a healthy society is always evolving, and it's different for different communities. And so I would encourage us to have a discussion around livability and name goals for livability based in neighborhood, but I don't think it's something that the city should mandate from the top down, because it's not an effective way to achieve shared goals.
Can you talk a little bit about your vision for your leadership team? The buzz that I get from a lot of the listservs that I'm on is that you as an urbanist, that to some people is scary. Now I've tried to present the idea that urbanists are people who are concerned about urban design and urban planning. And many people within the neighborhoods are concerned with those issues. They're concerned about traffic, which is an urban planning issue, or transportation. They're worried about how their buildings look. We're going to have a discussion about the design process, what the city looks like. So the people at the SNC feel like we are urbanists too. That said, there are people who we consider, I think Peter Steinberg coined the term urbanistas, people that are ideological pro-density advocates, and the only measure of success is bigger, 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 more and more people. There's a concern that you as an urbanist, and I would put you in the good urbanist category myself, are going to be heavily influenced by some of the more grow, unbridled growth kind of influences. Can you talk a little bit about who you think are good pundits or people who talk about this within the city or nationally, and kind of help either reassure or scare the neighborhoods in terms of where you speak a good line, but will you continue that, stay the course, as it were?
That's a lot of questions in one. Okay, so first, urbanista. I like that term because when I was in grad school studying urban design, urban planning, landscape architecture, and there was a great essay that came out called Whatever Happened to Urbanism? And it was talking about urbanism used to be a profession, the care and ecology and healthy society of city building used to be a profession that we all respected and talked about, and we relied on that professional expertise. And it kind of evaporated, and now we have different kind of much more narrow-focused professions of architecture, of planning, of policy, of the different political realm that are not really well integrated. And I think I'm that kind of urbanist. I'm an urbanist who cares about healthy cities, cares about healthy society as structured by the way the city is growing and evolving. And so I'm not an urbanista. I am not a pro-growth at any cost, let's let the developers solve our housing crisis kind of urbanist. That I do not align with them, although I am for people are moving here, we need to welcome them, but let's create a city that works for all of us, whether you've been here 5 years or 55 years. So in terms of the pundits or the thought leaders that I follow, I'll reveal here my deep lefty roots that David Harvey is one of my favorites. The idea of the right to the city, in that the right to create the city we want to live in and the economic structure that we want to participate in is one of the most fundamental human rights, and we need to have this conversation in our city ongoing continuously with the folks who live here about how do we want our city to be shaped. And we need to take it back a bit from the professionalism of top-down, we know best planning, but we also need to respect the professionalism of There are specific, deep tools that the city has access to and has authority for that they need to be using to shape how do we achieve this future vision. So, robust, constructive dialogue with community about the right to the city, what city, future city do we want to be, but also the city using its tools in the public interest to make sure that we are achieving the goals that we set for ourselves. Other leaders I like to follow are, I think, some of the work of Bruce Katz at Brookings, even though I don't always agree with his economics. He's very focused on how do we build urban economies strategically and intentionally, because right now we're in this mode of the economy is like the weather, we have no control over it, and all this stuff is happening. When we need to, at every level of government, city, state, and federal, have an intentional focus of what kind of economy we want to build and what can we do to build that economy. And in our city, I feel it's really important to build an economy that's creating middle-class family wage jobs, that's participating in the next economy, which to me is going to be a green energy revolution. And how do we make sure we're providing access to those jobs, especially for disadvantaged and low-income kids? The city needs to be much more intentional about guiding the economy that we want. Not just so it's wealth creation, as if that's somehow going to help the rest of us, but job creation and access to success for everybody. And so there are a couple other people, Neil Pierce I'd like to follow. I love Enrique Penalosa, who's the mayor of Bogota, who talks about transportation has to be democratic, it has to be available to everybody. Let's see, and I think the mayor of London is kind of interesting. I like watching what he's doing around housing. And I'll come up with somebody else, because there are lots of folks that are really strong around how you create healthy society and in healthy cities that are, more later.
Very good. I think that sets the perspective, and I would urge everyone to go out and look at the work on David Harvey. You can find him on YouTube. Amazon has announced that they're looking for another city for headquarters 2, HQ2. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Can I finish the other? I forgot the other one about management and leadership team.
Oh, yes,
this is really important to me. So I'm someone who's been in the private sector, in the public sector, and in the nonprofit sector, and in the advocacy world across my career. And I think it's essential to have a very clear, strong leadership structure, decision-making structure in the mayor's office. Because one of the problems we've had in the last 2 administrations is everything is driven by politics. And we need to have a mission-driven organization that has a future vision and an action agenda laid out transparently so people can understand where we're headed. And we need to have very clear communication channels with council and with other regional players so that we can establish collaboration. We need a commitment to collaboration because the mayor is not the czar. The mayor is one player organizing the energy of the city in a region that is quickly changing. So there has to be a lot of collaboration baked into this system. And then finally, professional level experts in the mayor's office who are relating to department leaders in a very defined way. Because one of the things that's happened again and again and again is there's a lot of expertise in departments that's trying to make good things happen, that's trying to make change, that's trying to implement new programs, and it's simply disconnected from the mayor's office. So what is going on in the mayor's office isn't connecting with what's going on in departments, and we're ending up wasting all that capacity and all that potential energy. A great organization has clear communication channels, clear decision-making structures, transparency and accountability, and we haven't had that, so I would bring that kind of professional organizational structure to the mayor's office, because we need to empower department heads to do their job, let them do their job, and hold them accountable to do their job. So, Amazon. Okay. So, Amazon, I think we all recognize, has been one of the forces for this very rapid breakneck growth that we've had that we're not keeping up with very well. And to me, I welcome this news as a relief. Amazon has provided a tremendous amount of jobs and brought a lot of new people to our city, new people that I welcome into our communities. But we cannot handle another 50,000 Amazon jobs in this city. So if they want to develop a second headquarters somewhere else, I welcome that. I don't think the city of Seattle should be competing for that because we don't need to be giving away any more tax breaks to large corporations. Instead, we need to be doing the opposite, is figuring out how to get them and their billions and billions of wealth they're generating in our city to invest in the public realm, to invest in transit, to invest in schools. So I welcome them, starting a new satellite second headquarters somewhere else while we're still dealing with how to catch up with the growth that we've already had in our city. So this idea that they're going to make cities compete against each other with tax breaks, it is a downward spiral, a lose-lose proposition, and I hope other cities are recognizing that and not falling for that.
What was the question?
What do you
Do you
say?
feel the same way about sports teams? So you have said you believe MHA and upzones are potentially something to be discussed. Although you did say you supported the grand bargain, which is an upzone everywhere. And so I think I understand how you're going to tease that out. You also have spoken about using a racial equity lens to prevent displacement. We have some very real problems in some neighborhoods right now of displacement that's happening very rapidly. For example, here in this CD. You talk a little bit about the social transformation affecting these working class neighborhoods. You alluded to David Harvey, who talks about the right to the city and some of that to some degree. Could you maybe synopsize quickly for our audience, a little more specifically about that?
So displacement is a crisis in our city, and one of the things that's made me really angry around my urbanist brothers and sisters is their denial of it. They're pretending like somehow the free market is going to magically provide everybody affordable housing, so go ahead and tear down, push out, because what we'll get instead is going to be somehow better, without any evidence and without really any logic to it. It's pure ideology. I think neighborhoods that were historically redlined in our city are most vulnerable and most at risk because we kept those property prices down and created communities of folks who, well, you know what redlining is, I don't need to describe it here, but I think now that we're in a situation where property values are lower in working class neighborhoods and South End neighborhoods, we now have this obligation to protect those communities that are being blown apart because when you live in a low-income neighborhood, when you've been there 20, 30, 40 years, it's family. And the city cannot allow developers to just come in and blow that apart for their own gain and walk away without any responsibility. So the city needs to convene much more sensitive, careful, community-based processes around how do we protect what we have in this community, how do we make sure that when we have growth that it is affordable to and targeted for and available to the folks from this community, and we can't impose top-down blanket upzones everywhere. It just simply is not going to work. We know how displacement quickly can destroy a neighborhood. We've seen it happen in other cities, and so we've got to put in process right now, and there are some really good models. The Liberty Bank model, the Southeast Opportunity Center model, that's for the development that's happening at the Othello station. Even the Capitol Hill Light Rail Station, it wasn't maybe a community at disadvantage or at risk of displacement, but the way the community and the developer and the city collaborated to define what that development would be and how do we make sure it's in the interest of community and the neighborhood was a really good model. So I think we know how to do it. We just have to commit to doing it and not do blanket upzones in communities that are vulnerable.
I think the gay community on Capitol Hill would say they are at risk up there. So. The question about something you stated. You said related to homeless housing. You want to put a focus on increasing supportive housing. Where and how would you do that? And how many units do you think that is?
Okay, this is also really complicated because there are a lot of contributing factors that create the crisis of homelessness. And it's more of a symptom of 5 or 10 or 20 different things that have gone wrong in our society. We are not funding mental health and behavioral health services. We are not adequately providing addiction services, addiction counseling and rehab for folks. we have a housing affordability crisis. And we are not really coordinating and collaborating well enough between King County Public Health and the services they provide and the homelessness services Seattle provides. So we have a whole bunch of things that are failing, and it results in more and more homelessness happening in our city, which is heartbreaking, especially the statistic that 30% of the homeless people in Seattle are under the age of 30. As a parent, it's impossible to imagine that. So, long-term, we have to have long-term supportive housing. There's some folks who are never going to be able to support themselves and live in market rate or even affordable housing without help. We've got to get more funding for long-term supportive housing. That can then free up space in shelters, and it can, help the shelters evolve to be, to meet the needs of folks like people who come with pets, who come with partners, who come with, alcoholism that they're not ready to get over yet. So we need to create long-term supportive housing so we can move people out of shelters, and then we need also more emergency shelters so that the folks sleeping outside right now, we have a place to get them inside so they have a roof over their head, because you absolutely have to have the security of a good night's sleep and knowing that you're safe to make the first step towards improving your own life. So all those things need to happen. Long-term supportive housing, I think the funding has to come from the state and possibly new progressive revenue sources that we can talk about later, and the philanthropic community. I think we all know that it's going to take all of us to build the kind of real solutions we need for the homelessness crisis.
There's been some innovation in other cities, for example, Los Angeles, to create subsidies to help homeowners create accessory dwelling units in their homes. Would you be supportive of that type of program? See that?
Yes, I think that's fascinating, because one of the crises of our housing affordability crisis is outsiders, whether they're real estate investment trusts or private equity firms or corporate landlords, coming in and buying up our housing stock. And the more we let that happen, the more we let our housing stock be owned by outsiders, the more we are sending our rent outside of our city instead of reinvesting locally. So, bigger picture long term, we have got to keep as much housing in local ownership as possible, and having tools to help individual homeowners to develop accessory dwelling units in their own homes where they can stay as the landlord and they get help from the state, city, or a nonprofit organization to do that development. That is a net good, because the more we own our own homes, the more we keep the rent from the rental income in our community, the better off we are. So it's a great solution.
Very good. You talk a lot about creating the missing, or helping fill in on the missing middle. The missing middle is the housing stock, which is smaller type housing stock. But that's often presented as townhouses. And as we know, townhouses are not affordable type units. Would you be interested in perhaps looking at downzoning in certain areas so that only cottage type housing and more affordable type housing can produce? And a second corollary to that, a big piece of the missing middle, which is no longer produced in Seattle, is condominium type housing in stacked flats or in larger buildings. What will you do to help change the problem that developers are having to produce condominium type housing, which is the ownership housing as opposed to rental housing?
So the missing middle is going to take 100 different tools on the table, 100 different possible solutions so that developers and homeowners and landowners can find the right tool that works for them. And I think we've created so much rigidity in our zoning and land use and building code system that we basically made a lot of viable solutions illegal. So I think we need to look in depth at what the problems are, the barriers are, and talk about strategically releasing some of those barriers and making these other housing types more possible. So can we make row houses work in this city? Maybe not. Maybe because we build with wood, row houses are never going to be a solution. But let's look at row houses, backyard cottages, stacked flats, as you talked about them, duplexes, triplexes. I think congregate housing, we didn't give that enough of a test. We need to go back and make those possible to build again and see if they work. rooming houses, SROs. There's all these models for more affordable housing that developers would build or nonprofits would build if we could. So I think the missing middle is going to require really fine-grained tweaking in the land use building code and zoning code. I'm not sure about downzoning. I'd have to look at it. It sounds like a step in the wrong direction, but maybe there are certain instances where it would work. Because I think, once you define a bunch of different tools for gentle, low-rise, multifamily that could be added to neighborhoods and gave a lot of different tools, I think neighborhoods would pick the ones that worked for them. And I think we could make it work through that process. Was there another part of that question?
Well, the condominium.
Oh, yeah.
on the state level.
That's also been really fascinating. We basically stopped building condominiums because of the liability issue. And so that's part of why we do not have enough inventory of starter homes, because traditionally that's how people get their first start. So definitely work with the state and regional players about rolling back some of the liability requirement, because we have to start building condominiums again. We've got to figure out a way to do that, because it's part of the failure.
So your discussion of all these different housing types, which have quite a bit of physical characteristic differences, and you talked about how neighborhoods potentially pick and choose those. To me, that sounds like, to some degree, that you're pointing out there's an issue with our zoning code in terms of what we're allowed to build, where we're allowed to build it, how that works. So, for example, there are some of our members who are dealing with the issue of row houses, where the developers are now subdividing properties and putting housing behind row houses, which kind of breaks that idea of a donut type block. Are you at all interested in going back and looking at our zoning code and perhaps revising it to allow some of these, or forcing some of these things to happen? For example, we see developers building townhouses in low-rise 3, expensive townhouses, where apartment buildings should be going in terms of higher density zone. Are you going to go back and tighten this up and create more tools and more housing option possibilities by using the zoning code as a mechanism to do that?
I think so. That's a great proposal. I think I need to sit down with the experts who understand exactly why we're not building more housing types that are affordable to people at all income levels and ages and stages in life, and understand specifically what are the barriers and how do we open up the possibility to build different housing types. The building expensive townhouses where we could have apartment buildings is a particular question that we should be looking at, because you're exactly right. We are tearing down the naturally affordable apartment buildings from the 50s and 60s that are, throughout the city, especially in Capitol Hill and Lower Queen Anne, and replacing them with fancy, townhomes and other models that are completely unaffordable to most of us. And it is a problem, and we should look particularly at that dynamic.
Would you help address a problem that many of us feel is happening, which is the city's inability to adequately assess growth impacts? We have, through the State Environmental Protection Act, an environmental impact process that looks at capacity issues. Yet we see this problem with parking and growth of cars. We have streets that are potentially too narrow to support emergency vehicles. We have sewer capacity issues throughout the city from an infrastructure standpoint. Would you be willing to be more stringent with your administration and the departments that are doing this analysis to really assess what the real impacts of growth are?
Yes, I think we've also failed on this, especially if you look at the school system. We have added 10,000 school-age children, but the city has done nothing to help get the funding in place to make new space for those students. So we should have built 20 new schools in the past 5-10 years. We built 1 or 2 maybe. We are not keeping 3, okay. We have not been keeping up with growth in that way. So I think we need to look at impact fees, definitely, to look at how, but they're very limited in how they can be used, and they come with the risk of the cost gets passed right on to the tenants. And so I think we have to be careful about using them. They're not the panacea, but they can be really useful for capital improvements in schools, for crosswalks, for bike lanes. So, no, not bike lanes. Wait, I get confused. Anyway, there's several things they can be used for that we need to be looking at. So I think we need to, but deeper than that, I think we need to look at our tax structure, because obviously we all see Amazon and other big tech companies making tremendous profits in our city. And are they contributing to the impact that they're creating? And I think we need to look at a much more steeply progressive B&O tax, so big corporations are paying a bigger share of than small and locally owned businesses. And we need to look at a capital gains tax on people with high incomes above $215,000 or more maybe. But that's
With that, with all the issues of fires and hurricanes elsewhere in the country, Seattle is potentially poised at some point, hopefully not in our lifetimes, but at some point for a pretty significant geological trauma. Some say that it could be pretty devastating. Do you think Seattle is prepared for that type of problem? And what would you do to help perhaps make us better prepared for that?
unless everyone in this room feels like they know exactly what they're going to do and exactly who to call and exactly how to organize in their community, then no, we're not prepared. We need a lot more information out in communities. I think the city has done a lot. There is an emergency management plan in the city, but we don't all know it. And so we might as well not have it if we don't all know what it is. I think we need to do a much better job understanding what might happen and what the impacts will be and what to do and how to support one another. We need to know how, emergency services are going to get through, how hospitals are going to stay open, what we need to do as citizens to facilitate that, but also to help one another. So, no, we're not ready, and yes, I would make sure we spent more effort on that, especially working with community groups. One of the things I've talked a lot about is when I come in, I want to sort of have a citywide conversation around vision and action agenda and how we're going to get to the future vision. And one of the 10 top things is emergency preparedness, because I think it's a key issue in our state. We all know the big one's coming, and in our city, and we're not ready.
How about from climate change, we talk about economic shocks, or potentially President starting a war with North Korea or something. What type of resiliency do you see the city taking in those regards?
Well, climate change, I think we're blessed in some ways that we don't have hurricanes and we're not really at risk for fire right here in the city. So a lot of the extreme weather events that are happening in the rest of the world are unlikely to happen here. But that said, we still do have an issue with water. In the future, there could potentially be water shortages in our region if we lose snowpack. And so there's a lot to plan for, and I think the resilience planning that they did in New York was a pretty good model. But here the challenges will be different, but I think we need, along with emergency management, we need to understand the resiliency planning and what we're doing long term. And the economic impacts of climate change, and I think this is all tied up with the globalization and the neoliberal economy, that there are extreme winners and losers happening. Like, we have abundant capital, too much capital in our city, and other places are starved. Other places have nothing, like everything failed. No bank, no Lions Club or Rotary Club, no funding for the police, no funding for schools, because their economy has been completely sucked dry. And so I think, as we're dealing with that condition, there's not a lot we can do to control that at the city level, but we can, know it's happening and know that there will be economic refugees continuing to come to our city who, because there's so much wealth here, because there are jobs here, people are going to come here from other places and hope they can be part of it. And we just have to know that's coming and accommodate that in our housing affordability plans and our homelessness response plans and our education plans, to know that we are probably going to see continued growth from those reasons too. Many administrations have done a very good job of dismantling the support that once existed for neighborhood community councils. Mayor Murray has dismantled the relationship the city has with the district councils,
Would you be interested in addressing that issue?
Definitely. When I first moved to Seattle in the 1997, the first work I did was on the Pioneer Square neighborhood plan. And I still think the neighborhood planning process in the 90s was a great model because there was a constructive future vision, there were targets that neighborhoods were asked to meet, and there was serious, intentional collaboration between the city and communities around what do we want to achieve and how do we want to achieve it together. And then maybe the city didn't follow through sufficiently on implementation, but at least there was an intention of, if to implement these projects, we will work with you, neighborhood matching funds, small and simple grants, and ongoing processes for shepherding the neighborhood plans into implementation. So I think that's a good model. We invented it here. Other cities have adopted it, and we let go of it, and we should bring it back here. So the community councils, I think, brought up a different kind of a problem, and I sympathize with and I see the problem that it created, that often groups can become exclusive because there's such a dense amount of knowledge and such a high level of expertise that they become unwelcoming and exclusive to folks who are just getting started. And you go to a first meeting, you don't understand the lingo, nobody welcomed you, nobody said, hey, I'm your mentor, I'd like to help you get engaged in this, what do you need from me, how can I be your buddy? So we didn't do that well enough, so they became very insular and exclusive, and we know how to fix that problem. You know, it takes time and resources, but we need to fix that problem. We need to get renters involved, we need to get people of color involved, we need to get people with less professional expertise involved and, you know, show them the ropes and give them the tools they need to succeed, because we all deserve access to help shape our city, and it shouldn't be exclusive to folks who are already insiders and have professional expertise.
An issue that may or may not be active when you take office is the issue of design review. There is a proposal on the table to do a significant modification of that. We're having a panel discussion after you leave on that particular topic. Can you just real quickly give us your thoughts on design review and its efficacy, where the process could be improved?
It's a really good question. I know it needs to be improved, and I would like to work with the experts who spend all their time in the process, who know exactly how it doesn't work and why it doesn't work, and hear from them. Because I don't have a silver bullet answer. I know we need to have community dialogue around growth and change in our communities. I know we need to block bad development. I know we need to greenlight good development. I know the design review process works against us sometimes and for us sometimes, and I would like to have a dialogue with folks who are experts at this, because I don't know enough about how to fix it to give an answer now, but I wish I could stay after and hear your panel discussion about it, because I need to learn more to help be part of the solution.
Watch the video. So you talked about neighborhoods having a voice and where density goes, how that would look and so on. There's a question here which says, would you let neighborhoods have a say in where bike paths are placed? And just to whoever wrote that question, here in the central area, they've been putting in the greenway definitions here, and that's been very much a community-based dialogue in terms of producing that. So I don't know if that's a problem elsewhere, but so for example, I think on 65th, there was an issue a few years ago about should that bike lane be closed on 65th. What are your thoughts on how transportation infrastructure questions are addressed, particularly when communities are involved or impacted?
So yes, I think communities should be involved in that decision. I think we've gotten away from robust, constructive community dialogue between the departments and communities in the past 4 years especially, and we need to bring that back. So community process should not be disconnected from actual decision-making processes. Department of Neighborhood should be a bridge. It should be a facilitator and a convener, so that when SDOT has a proposal, here's our complete bike network, here's how we think it should go through your neighborhood, we convene community process around, is this the right way? Did we understand it right? What are your better ideas? How can we improve this together? And I don't think we do enough of that. We don't do it effectively enough. So yes, definitely I would propose all those kind of things that affect the community, where we invest transportation dollars, how we design the bike system, yes, we need to have more robust dialogue with community members who know how things work in the neighborhood.
Finally, there's all this talk about density and growth in Seattle. And when people talk about density, no one ever really talks about what kind of density they've envisioned for Seattle and over what period of time. Seattle has become one of the most dense cities in the United States. It's popular in the top 10, which has also pushed it into the top 10 most expensive cities. So there's a very strong correlation between density and housing affordability. You've talked a little bit about how you think we need to address the housing affordability other than through market mechanisms. And at your last meeting with us, you talked about support for the community housing caucus strategies. But we don't talk about how dense, we should be. So for example, do you see us being as dense as a city like Boston, which is twice as dense as Seattle? Do you see us being as dense as a city, say, Manhattan? And over what time period do you think that happens? And I guess maybe what I'm asking is, how would you characterize yourself? Are you a slow growther? Are you a high density person? Maybe close out on some of that, help people understand what your vision is for how the city grows, what densities we talk about, urban village densities, density everywhere like Paris.
So I want to take exception to you said there's a correlation between density and affordability. I think they might not be exactly related. There are lots of examples of cities that are denser than us that are much more affordable than us. Chicago, Singapore, we were talking about that earlier. So just because we're growing I don't think that's causing the housing affordability crisis. That's happening somewhere else.
Chicago depopulated by about 1 million people, okay, in the 80s and 90s. So they have the capacity for more people, which are now coming back. Potentially the same thing could be argued about Seattle. So Seattle had higher density in its single-family zones, but people are having less kids in those neighborhoods. So how do you bring back density in the single-family neighborhoods? Do you do it by knocking down houses, or do you do it by adding accessory dwelling units and that sort of thing? Singapore has a very highly subsidized housing market. So affordability is not just because you're dense, but there are layers on top of it. That's what you're saying?
Yep. I think, the housing affordability crisis, we have got to recognize that part of what is happening is outside investment in our hot market is escalating prices on purpose. Like, they are here to game the system as if they're buying a hot stock and, they're trying to buy low, sell high. They are gaming the system, and we have got to put in better barriers to block that activity, or we're going to end up like Vancouver with 1.3 million or more median house price. Nobody can afford to move there. Companies are leaving because they can't attract employees. It's like a downward spiral. We have to stop that here before it happens here. In terms of what kind of density, that's a really good question. I think we should continue to have that conversation in every neighborhood. I think one of the things that was raised a few days ago that's a pretty good idea is should we look at having more urban villages farther north and south? Because have we maxed out the density in the urban villages we've already identified? Should we take that model and broaden it? Maybe we should. Let's have that conversation in those areas. I think, I live in a 5-story building. I haven't lived in a single family home since I left my parents' house because I love being around other people. I'm a very community-minded person. I'd like to bump into neighbors. I like to share space together. So, but that's my preference. I think everybody has a different idea about what good density looks like. So I think every neighborhood should be having that conversation. I love the quality of life of a place like Paris with 5- and 6-story buildings and commercial strips where everything's active and there's a lot of street life, a lot of public life, and great parks. I think that is a great model. I also like the big Asian cities that have high-rises and like that much intensity, and maybe some neighborhoods want to be like that. Maybe downtown wants to be like that. But I think let's have that conversation and figure out what works at a more kind of granular level.
Well, Cary, the Seattle Labor Coalition is all about conversation, and thank you for spending your time with us today. We wish you the best in the election.
Thank you, and I hope I've earned your vote.
We're going to take about 5 minutes while we